Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah and welcome to the Sharia Intelligence course. I am your host Muhammad Nuruddin Lemu, and with me to discuss today's topics are two of our distinguished facilitators, volunteers with the Da'wah Institute of Nigeria Islamic Education Trust, Brother Ibrahim Bello and Sister Salatu Sule. Assalamu alaikum, you're both welcome.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
We introduced this whole subject of the degrees of certainty and presumption and uncertainty in the way scholars classify evidence and how they use this evidence. We looked at the historical authenticity, the integrity of the source, but we also touched a little on the meaning and the implication of any particular evidence. And we did that by way of an overview. I'd like us to go through some of the salient points, some of what you would consider the most important takeaways on the subject of the certainty regarding the source, this thubut or wurud as it would be when applied to hadith. Sister Salatu, how certain are scholars when it comes to the Quran in particular, and we will move on to other sources?
When it comes to the...
If I add also, and why are they that certain?
Okay. To answer the first question, when it comes to the certainty of scholars around the authenticity of the Quran, their certainty is 100%. They qualify the Quran, as we mentioned previously, as qat'i thubut, meaning the authenticity of the Quran is so strong that there is no room for probable or reasonable doubt. And this is based upon the fact that when one looks at the history of how the Quran came about, the revelation of the Quran, the reception of the Quran from the by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how he transmitted it to the companions by reciting it to them, telling them about it, and in some cases the companions could tell when he was receiving revelation, and he taught them, and very many companions memorized the Quran. More importantly also was the fact that he had the Quran written down during his lifetime. Every verse, every word that was revealed, he had it written down. And after any verse or verses had been written down, he would ask the person writing to read it back to him so that he could confirm that it was faithfully written down. Then the fact that during his lifetime as well, he did not allow his own words to be recorded so that there would be no mixture between what he said and what was meant to be part of the Quran, the word of Allah. After he passed away, the companions carried on the tradition of protecting the integrity of the Quran by standardizing the volume itself, which is bringing together the Quran into a single volume, as well as standardizing the dialect in which it was written. And when confusion and debate started to arise among people who were not certain if certain variants, certain words that belonged to other dialects were part of the Quran or not, the companions took the steps to ensure that those variants were done away with and the standard Qurayshi dialect was preserved, as we talked about in the previous episode. What I would like to emphasize here is this idea of variants, because when one hears it for the first time, you think, wait, we are saying the Quran has more than one source or form or version. What actually happened was, while it was being revealed, there are certain words in some verses of the Quran where they actually belong to various other dialects, and the Prophet ﷺ himself confirmed this. So this was not a later discovery or some confusion that came up. It was something he affirmed and he said, and these dialects were known. What happened much later on was people who accepted Islam, they were not originally Arabs and they were learning Arabic. So when they would stumble across a word that was strange to them or belonged to some other dialect, different from the one they had learned, then they would raise questions. And they would say, oh, they saw this or they heard this, is this correct? And the companions, as I said, knowing that to allow such a thing to persist as Islam continued to spread, that was also it would also give room for corruption to come in. So they blocked that by saying, let us get companions together who have memorized the Quran, who are reliable, who will sit together and check and corroborate evidence and ask other companions, what do you remember about this? Naturally, one would look at such an endeavor and say, well, there could still be possibility of error. What if the companion you're asking about a verse forgot or made a mistake? That was why the corroboration was so important, that it's not just one companion who says, this is what I remember about this verse. That would have to be backed up by other sources. As we mentioned before, when we were talking about Hadith Mutawatir and Hadith Ahad, that's a distinct difference between them. That Mutawatir are those narrations that have so many independent chains that there's little or no room for reasonable doubt. It would actually be unreasonable to doubt what is being transmitted through so many independent chains. Similarly, when they were going through the standardization of the dialect, they made sure that they had so many companions confirming again and again that this is how the Quran was, this is a correct rendition based on Qurayshi dialect, that when a companion would say they have a different recollection, they have a different rendition, if that companion did not have corroboration, they would treat it as Hadith Ahad, meaning they would treat it as something that is gharib, strange, put it aside because it's not corroborated. Even if the companion is someone that is as trustworthy as Umar radiallahu anhu, they were that strict and that thorough about it. So when one looks at that, you will then understand what is meant whenever you hear or you see versions or variants with regard to the Quran. Another issue that comes up sometimes is, could some of those other variants have survived? Whether that happened or not, what we know based on multiple chain of narrations is that the Caliph at the time, Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu, went out of his way to find these variants that had been written down and had them destroyed and burnt, again to preserve that authenticity. And there's evidence today based on the manuscripts that have been found in recent times compared to those days, such as the manuscript in the Topkapi Museum, the manuscript in Tashkent, and the latest one, the manuscript in Birmingham University, where by carbon dating in particular, especially like the one in Birmingham, it's been shown that this particular manuscript was written within a few decades after the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Carbon dating will give you a narrow frame within which something was made or produced, but can't give you an exact point. However, by closer examination of the script and how it was written, it is believed now, there's enough evidence to suggest that it was actually written by a contemporary of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it is most definitely based on the Uthmani script because of the form of writing. Again, on this same issue of now looking at that, the more recent manuscripts, such as this, the Birmingham manuscript, as it is also called, the question then is this exactly like what we have today? And there, the scholars who did the work, they are not Muslims, at least a number of them. Their work is in archaeology and looking into these things, paleontology and so on. What they say is obvious is when it comes to the manner of writing, like the script or what words or letters are there or not there, or the diacritical marks that tell you what vowel sound you should make, that these are things that are different between that script and this script, because in essence, the form of writing has changed over time. That is even one of the ways that they use to peg the likely age of the manuscript. They'll tell you if it's Kufic script, for instance, then it cannot be older than this time because that script was designed or innovated around this time. So there you have differences. However, when it comes to the word, in reading it, you would actually see that it's the same as this. When I watched one of the videos where they were discussing the Birmingham manuscript and they had an imam come to read off the page, I couldn't see what he was reading, so I wouldn't know there are no diacritical marks. But by listening to him, I could easily say, oh, it is that specific verse where Allah says, keep yourself patient with those who call on him night and day. So when it comes to the words, the meaning, not the written words, but the words when they are said, it's actually what we have today. And it's for reasons such as this that you would see why scholars in the past said when it comes to the Quran, it is called ithbut. And recent findings like these manuscripts just reconfirm and reaffirm that from the time of those early mujtahidun and scholars to our time, there has been that continued tradition of preserving the integrity of the Quranic text.
And I think it's worth underscoring the fact that the Quran has not just been preserved from the time of the Prophet in writing, and the next generation had it in writing, and the subsequent generations until today, we've had the Quran in writing, and every generation, even the time of Uthman, they had the one put together at the time of Abu Bakr in writing, available even at their time. But that we have always had people who have memorized the Quran.
Yes.
In fact, for every verse of the Quran, there are hundreds of people who have memorized that verse.
Maybe even thousands.
Thousands. And so while you may not have a thousand people, say, during the life of the companions, who have all memorized the whole Quran, just as we have today, it is difficult for you to go into a mosque and of any reasonable congregation, start reciting, the Imam makes a mistake, and there's always somebody to correct. So we've had this,
supportive and collaborative preservation
of the Quran that, and historically there has been no debate among the scholars regarding the Qurayshi mutawatir, multiple chain versions of the Quran. Brother Ibrahim, what's the implication of all of this?
Yeah, like you mentioned earlier, Quran is divine, and there is no doubt. Historically, and even the non-Muslims, specialists, archaeologists, and others were able to prove that. So what that goes along to say is Quran now is divine, and it is implying that it is authoritative and providing a what you can call definitive divine truths from God, source of guidance, and that all rulings that are based on Quran are qat'i, subut, like the authoritative or the historical authenticity in that regard is certain 100%. And so we confidently can say we are sure this is from God, and that is ilmul yaqeen. But the implications are whatever ruling based on Quran, we are very sure of it. Of course, Quran can give variety of rulings depending on the spectrum from the liability. Quran can make something wajib, it can make something fard, it can make something mubah. Okay? But whatever is based on Quran is definitive. And that anybody that challenge the authenticity or authority of the Quran is actually challenging the authority of God. And so that can be used as a thick line of defining what makes a Muslim. And so scholars are saying heavy decisions of what makes somebody a Muslim and what makes him not should actually be based on something of this authority. And so you can use that as a line of divide. Other things are, while Quran has all of this, it's not necessarily that every ruling of Quran is binding, but like we said earlier, it can provide that authoritative implication, and it can be used to identify what makes a Muslim, what takes somebody out of Islam. And in fact, all the prohibitions made by Quran are binding upon each and every Muslim. Anybody has no room to disagree with what has been proven beyond doubt from Quran. When we come to issues of meaning and implications, we may have more than one angle to interpretation. But as it's truly from God, is providing what you can call ilmul yaqeen. That is like a unanimous agreement among the Muslim scholars.
So from what you're both saying, the Quran is a definitive source of divine truth.
Yeah.
So when we say the Quran said, we are comfortably saying God said.
Yes.
It's another thing to discuss what did it mean, and what are the implications, which we touched on briefly, and we will come back to that in more detail. But as you've mentioned, as a source of divine truth, no Muslim disagrees with the Quran as a source.
Yes.
And as you've mentioned, for Muslims, it is the word of Allah. And for some non-Muslims, even if they don't take it as the word of Allah, they at least would say there has been no change in the Quran when it comes to its meaning from the time of the Prophet until today, for those who have studied it. Of course, this is not a session where we will be looking at, so where did the Quran come from? If we can say historical criticism can take the Quran back to the time of the Prophet, we can prove we are dealing with the same scripture, the same words, the same verses. Where did that come from? Did that come from the Prophet himself? Did that come from Allah? That's a separate discussion for Muslims, and for others it is an interesting subject, but that's handled by other authors, and that's out of our interest for now, but worth pursuing at some other time. The second thing I'd like to come to is the hadith, sometimes called the sunnah. What is the difference between sunnah and hadith, and what level of certainty do we have? We've touched this briefly, so I'd like you to just touch on the most salient points, inshallah.
Yeah, hadith and sunnah loosely used interchangeably, but in reality, when we look closer, they are two separate things. Of course, you have all these technicalities in Quran and Islamic literature that are like mutaradifat. When they come together, they come to mean two different things. But in different instances, one can be used to mean the other.
It's a synonym.
Thank you. Now, hadith are the recordings or records of the deeds and actions of the prophets, his lifetime, his history, the companions around him, the context surrounding his life, from his birth, even before becoming a prophet, and all that transpire, biography sort of a thing. So this is hadith. It's like the record and the history all together. While sunnah is that part of his history and the recordings of his actions and tacit approval and all of that, that has legal implication, that has religious implication, that is meant for Muslims to live by as a source of law, okay, to emulate. So in other words, hadith is the source of sunnah, but not all hadith constitute sunnah. Some hadith are actually just sirah, biography, while he was young. He went to Cave Hira, he went to this, he went to that. He had this brother, he lived with this companion came to him. So person accepted Islam. In so year, something happened. Like all of those things are just history. Also, you can have other sources of sunnah also, like Amalu Ahl al-Madina to the Maliki scholars and those that support that position. That when you say sunnah, actually those aspects of Prophet life that has religious implication or legal, legislative implication and are meant to emulate Medina or the praxis of Medina can be. Because it is
Medina at the time.
Yes, at the time.
Yes.
Because it is believed that the entirety of Medina is a city or what you can call a state based on the teachings of Islam. Sahabas, thousands of them live and die there. So everything known in Medina was synonymous to Islam as at that time. So this could be another source. So this basically is the difference between Sunnah and Hadith. But then sometimes, like I say, they are loosely used interchangeably.
So I think when people say we follow Kitab wa Sunnah, they actually also mean Quran and Hadith. And so this explanation of the Hadith as a narration that carries the Sunnah, Hadith as narrations from which we can study and know what the Sunnah of the Prophet is. So as you said, as one major source of Sunnah, but in the Malikis, the Amal Ahl al-Madina, the practice of the people of Medina at the time of Malik bin Anas. He met a city that had absorbed a lot of the Sunnah, and some of the Sunnah, of course, was written in Hadith, but Malik also looked at some of the sunnah might not have been written, but it was practiced, and so that was an important source. Sister Salah, regarding the levels of certainty, you've touched on this before, but just by way of recap and summary, what are the key things we should remember when it comes to certainty that we get from hadith?
Okay, the key things to remember is that when it comes to certainty that we get from hadith, we would classify them, any hadith, as either being qat'i thubut or dhanni thubut, or as they would say, qat'i wurud or dhanni wurud. Meaning that when it comes to the source, you look at the number of chains of narration that bring forth this particular statement that the Prophet ﷺ was reported to have said, or something he was reported to have done, or a way he was reported to have acted. That is what would give the scholar the basis for saying it is qat'i, meaning it is hadith mutawatir. There are so many chains that have put this matter beyond reasonable doubt. Or the scholar would, or scholars would then have concluded that some hadith are hadith ahad, meaning the number of chains of narration are so few that there is still room to have some level of doubt about whether this is exactly as it was reported. Did this happen or didn't it happen? And that's the summary of it. Now, just to add another point, the fact that any hadith is said to be ahad hadith doesn't mean it's disregarded, doesn't mean it lacks authority completely. It affects the weight that's given to it. It affects, depending on the school of thought, what other secondary tool might be brought in, might be used before this particular hadith is considered. That is the important thing to remember about authenticity of hadith.
Okay. Could you shed a bit more light again by way of summary? Because this subject area of the authenticity of sources of evidence, the credibility, the level of certainty we associate with any piece of evidence is really important. And so most of what we want to do in this episode is really just recap some critical things that are new to many of our audiences. And so I'd like you to touch again hadith mutawatir. What do you mean by hadith mutawatir, and what are the implications? And I'll come to Malam Ibrahim on hadith ahad or khabar wahid. What does that mean, and what are the implications? So mutawatir.
So we look again at hadith mutawatir. And what is the general definition is so many multiple chains of narration. And by multiple chains, they are saying that each chain is independent, and you have multiple narrators at every stage in these chains when you are looking specifically at the first 3 generations after the time of the Prophet ﷺ. That's one. Now you have those hadith that on their own, they would ordinarily be classified as dhanni thubut or dhanni wurud, meaning the source is not qat'i, it's not certain, it doesn't have that degree of certainty because of the number of narrations, of chains of narrations. However, when they look at hadith such as that, if it's corroborated by many other hadith, sometimes with regard to the meaning, and usually that's where you see this happening, then that hadith is treated as though it's classified as mutawatir. What I'm saying in a nutshell is when we say mutawatir, we could be talking about there are multiple chains of narration and they all carry the same wording. So that's where they would say it's mutawatir based on the lafzi, the words. Or it could be multiple because the words are different, but the meaning, that's where they talk about ma'nawi, or the action, that is amali, is the same ultimately. The implication at the end of the day is the same. A very good example is the well-known hadith, Inna amalu biniyya. I know the first time I heard that, they said that one is single chain, it's ahad. It's even gharib being the lowest level of ahad hadith, the one that is said to be strange. I was like, huh? Because everybody knows that. Everybody knows it. However, what has strengthened it and kept it as a hadith of great authority is the number of other hadith that have been worded in different ways, some very long, but ultimately the meaning, the implication of those other narrations boil down to the same thing, that every action will be judged based on the intention that comes with it. And we have verses of the Quran saying the same thing. And those other multiple chain hadith are independent chains, strong in and of themselves, corroborating one another, and by their meaning, ma'nawi, corroborating this gharib hadith. So the implication, therefore, is that for the scholars, they are looking at those chains of narration. They're also looking at the issue of corroboration. And what is being corroborated? Is it the words, or the implication, or the action? And once they find that level of corroboration, then they classify them as hadith mutawatir, which are therefore very strong and capable of establishing those extremes in value judgments across the schools.
By which you mean mutawatir hadith, it is agreed, just as with the Quran, can make something compulsory, encouraged,
or haram, forbidden, encouraged, mubah, or just say it's mubah, you can do, you can leave it, or makruh, it's disliked. Yes.
And I think, as mentioned earlier, also the hadith mutawatir and the Quran are the only sources that are regarded as qat'i thubut, that are definitive, categorical. Nobody argues with their legitimacy and authority as sources of truth, and so establishing fundamentals of the deen and all of that. Mother Ibrahim, what would you say about ahad hadith?
Yeah, ahad hadith, like the name implies, wahid ahad, meaning single, like when you have plural of singles. Okay, but technically it just means to say any hadith that is less authoritative than mutawatir. Scholars of usul have been careful on the level of certainty and authority they ascribe to evidence based on their source of authenticity. So it will not be fair to say the implication of an evidence that we are definitively certain is from God is the same with that of where we have some chances, some possibilities, some percentage possibility of error, even if it's 5% or 10%. Of course, 90%, yeah, most likely, most probable. But where you are like, for sure. So they've been trying to be careful, particularly because the implications are, you want to say, God say, God mean you should do. And the implications might go as far as affecting lives and decisions. So they try to be fair. And so in this regard, they say any hadith that is less than mutawatir is ahad. Usually they say it, chain that is less than 10. Any hadith that has less than 10 riwats or 10 riwayah at each level, from the Sahaba to the Tabi'i to the Tabi'i, is considered ahad. But then ahad doesn't like mean they are strange, they are solitary. All of them agree that they are source of guidance, they are corroborative, they can make rulings. They only differ on the imperativeness or the authority of the rulings they will establish. Can you sentence somebody out of Islam because of a hadith ahad? Most will say no. Of course, Shafi'i and Hanbali will be like, once they are authentic, forget about whether it is ahad or not.
That's for amal and haram.
Yes.
But for Aqidah, I think there's a consensus.
For Aqidah. Yeah. So, thank you. You can't send somebody out of Islam, like excommunicate him, because of something that's some question mark. So they also try to, okay, what else? Yeah, there are many things it can do. However, if it is supported by other evidence, fine and good. So in this line, they try to be fair. It can make mustahab, it can make makruh. Like the Maliki particularly and the Hanafi, they are like, hadith ahad cannot make something haram, cannot make something wajib. But between, while they agree is a source of guidance, but then it's not strong enough to establish those things that you can say they are the pillars of Islam. And it's not that they are doubting the authority of this hadith, but just like I said earlier, we're trying to be very sure of if we're really submitting to God, submitting to the willing of the prophets. So they need to be very sure of us, are we really sure of the evidence first before we start making equations out of it. So these are the implications, and this is, so hadith ahad, usually you say hadith that has less than 10 chain, and further classified into different levels too. Some will have mashhur, you have aziz, but the weakest of hadith ahad is actually garib, where you have just a single chain hadith. Only one sahabi related it, and only one tabi'i, or only one tabi'i, or along the way, only one person left in those 3 generations, and all the riwayat converge on him. They will put a big question mark on it, because the Prophet lived in the full light of history. Everything about him is reported, like nobody whose life is most reported like him. So how will you just say, just on each important issue, that is only one person that noticed and reported it? So that's just why scholars of usul were very concerned with this level of categorization.
So this is all very important. From what you are saying, there are certain things that hadith mutawatir can do when it comes to Islamic law. They can establish the fundamental articles of faith and creed, just as the Quran can. They can establish the fundamental essentials of the religion, the ma'alum min ad-din bid-darura. The Quran and the hadith mutawatir can do that.
Yeah.
Ahad hadith, however, cannot establish fundamental creed. They cannot establish those things that make you a Muslim or take you out of Islam. They don't give ilm al-yaqeen. They don't give certainty of truth. Regarding the classification, Sister Salah mentioned there was the lafzi, there's ma'nawi, and said a little. Could you shed more light on these classifications of the mutawatir hadith with some examples?
Yeah, like we say, mutawatir hadith just means there is convergence. Many Sahaba reported a hadith, and it cut across all the generations. It means it was widely known. It was so popular that beyond doubt that nobody can say the Prophet didn't do it. Now, you want to look at it in a time when there was no recording system, when there was no thing like that. People can only memorize, and not really memorize, they could only report what they understood. So you have instances where one hadith, the same text was reported over and over by more than 70 Sahabas, like the hadith on Takbiratul Ihram, like the hadith of Man Kazaba Alayya Muta'amidan Falyatabawwa Maq'adahu Minan Nar.
Takbiratul Ihram,
yeah, I mean the initial takbir you do before commencing Salah.
Yeah, it's in mutawatir.
Mutawatir, yes.
It's multiple chains.
Yeah, like the hadith of Man Kazaba Alayya Muta'amidan. Whosoever lie against me deliberately is a bona fide member of hell. Like the hadith of Tashahud. You have more than 40 riwayah. Now these ones can be mutawatir al-lafzi, the texts.
And the Banu Qurayza one.
And the Banu Qurayza. La yusalliyanna ahadukum al-asra illa fi Banu Qurayza. None of you shall say Asr prayer till you get to Banu Qurayza. Now these were widely known. However, there are other ahadith where it was implied. The texts were not the same, but it was implied that the Prophet actually did that, like the case of Innamal Amalu bin Niyat, and a number of other issues. How many raka'ah do you pray Zuhur? How many raka'ah is Asr? Like to say hadith, no, but action proves it, that the Prophet did that here and there. So this one is mutawatir al-ma'anawi, meaning by implication also, it was what was done in broad daylight of history. Everybody saw it. But of course, because it was not reported word to word, like when you describe the timings of prayers too were described in a hadith that you can call mutawatir al-ma'nawi. All the 5 daily prayers what is their time range? When does it commence? You have many riwayat, but in different weddings. That makes it so sure that nobody doubt it. It's just because people were not recording then, people could only report what they understood. So this is the difference, and all of these were considered by scholars to have the same implication.
So just because the number of rak'ahs or the exact number of prayers we do in a day, the number of salat, is not explicit in the Quran, it doesn't mean it's an area where there's doubt.
No.
We have multiple chains of historical evidence from hundreds of Sahaba, and we don't even see a difference of opinion among the Sahaba regarding, how many prayers for how many rak'ahs in Subuh or Maghrib. These are areas that have become part of the Ma'alum min ad-din bid-darura, areas that are fundamental. All Muslims agree on these areas because the source of evidence is undisputed, and what it teaches is very categorical. Sister Salah, before we round up, what would you say by way of summary on Ahad Hadith?
I think it's important to just remember the variations even among Ahad Hadith, that there's a gradation which Brother Ibrahim Bello mentioned, and that looking at these still doesn't mean that any will be discarded. It's just the strength that's given to it. And some might wonder why they might call it splitting hairs. If at the end of the day you say the hadith are still useful, then why bother to even have nuanced classification as such? And it's just the reminder that when it comes to the field of usul al-fiqh, where the mujtahid does a lot of his or her work, the mujtahid is trying to preserve the spirit, is trying to be faithful to the spirit of Islam, as well as be faithful to what it is that is actually connected directly to the will of Allah. And in doing so, they need to be careful where a difference such as one person or two people in a chain is essential, and the mujtahid is interested in increasing the level of certainty and getting as close to the truth as possible. And in such cases, one step will make a difference from no step at all, and two steps a difference from one step.
This is good. And I think, as has already been mentioned, all schools recognize the authority of Ahad Hadith. Yeah. What they differ on is the authority. In other words, what can an Ahad Hadith do independently? If Ahad Hadith is supported by other evidence like Qiyas, or for Malikis like the Amal Ahl al-Madina, it gives its greater strength. Ahad Hadith, for example, as you've already mentioned, on its own, a solitary hadith or one with a very few chains for the Maliki, on its own, that's not enough to make a thing fard or compulsory. It's not enough to make something haram. It needs extra support, especially from Amal Ahl al-Madina. Whereas in the Hanafis, for example, Ahad Hadith cannot make something fard. It can make wajib, which is a step of certainty below fard. It cannot make haram, but it can make makruh tahrimi. And in the Shafi and the Hanafi school, however, an Ahad Hadith can do what the Quran can do. It can do fard, it can do mustahab, makruh, mubah, and haram. And as we see, say, in the difference of opinion among scholars regarding eating carnivorous animals, there's an Ahad Hadith that is sahih, it is authentic, that says a Muslim should not eat birds of prey or birds with talons, nor should we eat animals that have canine teeth, in other words, carnivorous animals. But the Malikis view that hadith as insufficient to make the eating of those animals haram, so it makes them makruh because it is solitary and it doesn't have supporting evidence, whereas the Hanafis and the Shafis, again, Hanafis would put it under makruh tahrimi, the Shafi and the Hanbali would say it is haram. Of course, there's some diversity within some of these schools, but in principle, they all accept the authority of Ahad Hadith. They just differ in how much authority it has when it comes to specific types of rulings and what can strengthen or maximize that certainty. Inshallah, we will stop there for now. Next issue, we will be looking at the implications of each of these. We've touched some of this very briefly, but we will look at the implications, the meanings, and how scholars classify that, just so that we really understand this subject area before we move on to the application of usul and we move into qawaid and maqasid. Thank you both for your time. Jazakumullahu khairan. Until next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.